Good morning, everyone. We'll give it a few minutes for folks to join before we kick off for today. Good morning to those who have joined us. We'll give it a few minutes for folks to join, but as we get started, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat just so we can know who's in the room. For those who have just joined, we're just giving it a couple minutes as folks trickle in. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat so we can get a sense of who's in the room. Great, I think we can get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Toolbox Tuesday. Today's session is on Good Data, Stronger Tribes, Understanding Data Shortcomings for Native Americans. My name is Anika Vinile, and I'll be kicking off today's session before I hand things over to our speaker, Robert Maxim. As we get started, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat so we can get a sense of who's in the room. Now for some meeting logistics. This meeting is anticipated to take about an hour and a half. This meeting is being recorded, and the presentations and recording will be posted on the SCAG website and sent to everyone who registered for the event. All participants will be muted upon entry, and at the end of the session, there will be an opportunity for questions. If you have a question during any of the presentations, we encourage you to type it directly into the chat, or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom during the question and answer. We'll answer any questions at the end of the session. I'd now like to offer a land acknowledgement. We are currently on occupied and unceded land of Indigenous peoples who are and have been the traditional caretakers of the land in this region. I'm calling in from the Chumash and Tongva land. If you haven't already, I encourage you all to visit the resources that will be shared in the chat to learn more about the land and Indigenous communities where you live. So a quick overview of our agenda today. I'll start off with a quick overview of SCAG's Inclusive Economic Recovery Strategy, and then welcome our speaker, Robert Maxim from Brookings Metro. He will then give a presentation on the findings from the recently published report, Good Data, Stronger Tribes. And then we'll have some time for some questions before we wrap up. So next, we have a quick poll to get a sense of who's in the room. We have 3 questions. What county are you located in? What type of organization do you represent? And finally, how familiar are you with data related to Native American communities, such as demographics, health, education, tribal governments, or land use? I'll give you all some time to quickly answer those questions. Give you just a couple more seconds. I see almost up to full participation. Great, I'm going to end the poll now. It looks like we got almost full participation here. So first here, you can see what county are you located in. It looks like the majority here are from Los Angeles County, although that's followed quickly with about 30% from outside the SCAG region and even 9% from outside California. Looks like we have about 60% from the SCAG region and the other 40% is outside of the SCAG region. In terms of what type of organization do you represent, it looks like our number one response here is an other public agency, followed closely by cities and counties, nonprofits, NGOs, and community-based organizations. We have a couple of others in here, and then a mix from academic, private, consultant, and tribal governments. Finally, it looks like the majority of you are slightly familiar with data related to Native American communities. Some of you are not at all familiar. Sounds like we can learn a bit more today. We have some folks that are moderately familiar and the lowest category here, very familiar. So hopefully we're all able to learn something from today's session and get off to the next. Thank you all for participating in that poll. Apologize, the slide control sometimes is a little bit delayed. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic presented unexpected shocks in all of our lives. It highlighted inequities in the system as the communities who were most at risk were communities of color and lower income communities. In response to this, in July 2021, SCAG's Regional Council adopted the Inclusive Economic Recovery Strategy, or IERS, and put forth a vision and strategies for a more inclusive approach to economic development. SCAG strategy development was guided by 5 core principles, with the primary intent of fostering greater economic opportunity for women and communities of color, and to narrow economic disparities existing in the local and regional economies today. So I'm going to quickly show a video about how SCAG is working with local partners to foster more inclusive economic prosperity.
The Inclusive Economic Recovery Strategy was born out of this realization there are disparities in our society, in our region. And specifically, as we were coming out of COVID, it was very clear to all of us, we needed to make sure that the recovery did not leave people behind.
These disparities have major impacts in our communities, especially our communities of color. We're talking about health inequities, educational inequities, workforce development. Everything that we need for our communities to succeed are still being dragged down by these inequities.
The reality is, because of the inequities as an economy, we're actually underperforming. That economy thrives on equal access of all people to the resources in the regions. It's real people that are affected by marginal access to opportunities, whether it's education, jobs, or healthcare. That access that they don't have is actually a drag on the economy.
We need to create an economy that works for everyone and no one is left behind.
So our role is to open up opportunities to those who are marginalized or systemically marginalized over time.
We could set a framework that will help future generations thrive and succeed.
How do we make sure that anybody from any walk of life, from any ethnicity, have equal access to those opportunities? And so that was one of the things that we wanted to do, to help our local jurisdictions to provide that access.
This is not just for this generation, but leaving that wealth of knowledge and inclusivity for future generations to take advantage of is so important.
Apprenticeship programs are a valuable resource because it just expands their knowledge of what is out there that they can learn. And they will eventually graduate with a 4-year degree and become a manager, become an engineer.
Kind of leverage the skills that I picked up at school and use it in the workforce while essentially starting my career.
Up to this point, most tribes they've had to rely on existing sources in terms of data. And without having good data and reliable data and updated data, it's real difficult to plan. So the work that tribes are doing in conjunction with SCAG not only benefits tribes generally, but also benefits the local region. And that's why we're excited about developing analysis and service with SCAG, because it's really needed for tribes to plan for the immediate and also the distant future.
One of the opportunities that we have is helping marginalized communities to have access to government contracting processes. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to do, is to help anybody that's an entrepreneur or from any walk of life have access to it. At SCAG, we want to make sure that we have a prosperous society for all people.
Together with SCAG, we can turn everyone's dreams into reality.
And so if we get it right, we will be inching towards that high objective of making sure that economic opportunities are available to all.
Great, thank you. So as you can see, SCAG has a strong commitment to implementing this inclusive economic recovery strategy. With Senator Susan Rubio's support, SCAG was awarded a one-time $3.5 million grant from the state to implement several core recommendations. These grant deliverables can be broken down into 7 different projects across the economic and workforce development ecosystem. And all of these projects were recommendations from the IRS report and developed in collaboration with the community. Recent work included the Addressing Various Economic Opportunities report, which identified and quantified structural challenges that limit access to economic opportunity across Southern California. A report that explored how apprenticeship programs can address workforce gaps and provide meaningful debt-free pathways for job training and employment opportunities. And finally, Good Data, Stronger Tribes, which is what we'll be talking about today. This is a report published in partnership with Brookings Metro, and it explores how to overcome Native American data challenges in Southern California. Our speaker, Robert Maxim, will be discussing the key findings from this report today. If you're interested in learning more about SCAG's work, please check out these links in the chat. I apologize. I think the slides are moving a little bit delayed. So next up, let's welcome Robert Maxim from Brookings Metro. Robert Maxim of Mashpee Wampanoag leads Brookings Metro's work on tribal economies. Maxim's research has focused on an array of different research and policy issues in Indian country, including the effects of federal funding cuts on tribes, the exclusion of Native Americans from public data sets, how federal data misrepresents Native American identity, Native workers' ability to access remote work, the role of Native American community development financial institutions in tribal economic development, the lingering impacts of federal Indian boarding schools on tribal communities, and policy proposals to support Native Americans serving higher education institutions. Maxim's research and commentary on Native issues has appeared in numerous national and regional media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, National Public Radio, Marketplace, Time, Indian Country Today, Native News Online, and others. Within Brookings, Maxim has led efforts to resurface the institution's historic engagement in tribal communities, including the landmark 1928 Merriam Report, and to engage with Native-led organizations on enabling future research centering Native American people. Maxim also conducts research and designs policy proposals exploring how globalization, technological change, and other economic trends affect people and places. His work has included measuring the effects of U.S. tariffs and trade policy, quantifying the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence on U.S. workers, assessing federal place-based industrial policy investments, broadening access to highly digital employment, and also supporting the missions of regional public universities. Recently, Robert worked with SCAG to help publish this Good Data, Stronger Tribes report. This report explores how to overcome Native American data challenges in Southern California. Let's welcome Rob as I pass it over to him for his presentation.
Tapata Shanika, thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. Wani matompan wami. Good morning, everyone. Netaswis apuna kiski katahane. My name is Rob Maxim, and I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution in DC, where I lead much of our work on tribal communities. A lot of my work is at the intersection of place-based policy and tribal communities. So in addition to federal policy, I also think a lot about how states, regions, and local policy affects tribes and Native people. So as Anika mentioned, today I'm going to take you through a recent report that our team at Brookings published with SCAG called Good Data, Stronger Tribes, Overcoming Native American Data Challenges in Southern California. A lot of this presentation is going to be built on that report. So what I'm going to do, I'll overview some key findings and ideas from action from that report. And then I know there may be a lot of folks interested in using Native-focused data on the call today. So I'll plan to conclude with just a few of my own recommended best practices for collecting, aggregating, and using data about tribes and Native people. So it sounds like maybe we're having some issues with the slides. If at any point it would be easier, Anika, to just like have me screen share, let me know and I can take over. And then before we go any further, I just really want to particularly thank Victor Negrete and David Salgado at SCAG, who are our partners in putting together this report. It really couldn't have happened without their hard work, so I just want to acknowledge everything that they did to make this a reality. I think today's discussion is particularly timely. Like I said, I'm based in DC, where we're about 10.5 hours away from a government shutdown. The latest reporting has said that in the event of a shutdown, most federal statistical agencies won't be publishing any new data releases. So I think this idea of data availability and data integrity and its importance for governance doesn't just matter for Native communities, but really the nation as a whole. So what I'm going to do, I have some slides we can go through. I want to make sure we leave some time at the end for questions. So if it looks like we're running short, maybe I'll skip some of the less key ideas, and we can come back in questions if folks want. So just as a quick agenda, once this shifts to the next page here, first I'll give you a little context on myself and briefly overview some of the terminology that I'm going to use in this presentation. I'll then overview our recent project work and take you through some of the core issues of Native data that we surfaced in our work. I'll discuss some of the ideas for action we developed in the report, and then I'll close by sharing some thoughts I have about best practices for working with Native data. So just by way of background, Nu Tomas Masipia Kanu Wampanoag. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. We are the indigenous people of southeastern Massachusetts. And today our main reservation is on the town of Mashpee on Cape Cod. So on the left on the slide is a map of what is today called southeastern New England, as it would have looked in the 17th century. So Mashpee, my tribe's community, which is circled in red, was a Wampanoag village before colonization. And then these are just a few pictures of my family. But for me, data in the way that Native people are reflected in it has permeated my entire life. Our tribe didn't receive federal recognition until 2007. So about half my life, the federal government, for all intents and purposes, didn't consider me to be a real Native American. Until, of course, one day it changed its mind and did. And then to top it off, my father's Wampanoag and my mom is white, so I'm rarely counted as Native in many data sets unless I make it clear that I'm Native, and typically only Native, and want to be counted as such. So this isn't just a professional interest of mine as a mixed race Native person. This is also really a personal interest as well. So I next want to take you through just a brief overview of some of the indigenous terminology that I'm going to use in this presentation and I use in my work. I find when working in the policy space, people may feel some ambiguity when it comes to what Native terms to use and when. And so this is really to help put folks at ease and maybe, for folks that don't work in this space a lot, to have a better understanding of some of the terms that get thrown around. And I should just note that I'm one Native person presenting the terms I use here, so I don't speak for all Native people. Other people may feel differently about this, but this is how I talk about things. So first, when you hear the term American Indian, it describes a Native person from the continental 48 states. So Indian's obviously an antiquated term. It's one that's frankly based on a really massive geographical miscalculation that happened over 500 years ago. But it's also become a term that's reclaimed by some Native people, and I think also has a really specific legal definition. So if you hear me use the term American Indian, I'm referring to indigenous people from the lower 48. Alaska Natives are Native people from what is today the state of Alaska. Important to note that it's always Alaska Native and not Native Alaskan or Alaskan Native. And Alaska Native people have a distinct history of relations with and colonization by Europeans and Americans compared to American Indian people from the continental 48. Today, there's also a distinct legal framework that governs relations between Alaska Native people and the US government. So for these reasons, Alaska Natives are considered a distinct group. American Indians and Alaska Natives together, I call Native Americans. So collectively, American Indians and Alaska Natives are the two primary group of indigenous peoples from the American continent who were colonized by and are today part of the US. Throughout my presentation, you'll hear me use the phrases American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native American pretty interchangeably. However, these are not the only indigenous peoples in the US. I refer to indigenous peoples of Hawaii as Native Hawaiians. There's basically two reasons that Native Hawaiians aren't considered Native Americans. First, Hawaii is not part of the American continent. It was settled originally at a different time and by different groups of indigenous people than the Americas. And then second, Hawaii didn't become part of the US under the same historical circumstances as the territory of American Indians and Alaska Native tribes. The sovereign government of the Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown by the US, and Hawaii was annexed in the late 1800s. Today, there are continued debates among Hawaiian people about their place in the US, and even whether terms like Native Hawaiian are appropriate. So because of that, that unique history, I really refer to Native Hawaiian people as a distinct population. However, as you'll see, there are a lot of shared interests between Native Hawaiian people and American Indian Alaska Natives, and we are all indigenous. And then finally, there are other indigenous peoples in both the US and throughout the Americas. Samoan people in American Samoa, Guamanian and Chamorro people in Guam. There are also indigenous people in other US territories and in every country in the Americas. And so as you'll see in this presentation and in our report, the migration of indigenous people into and across the US is a significant factor affecting data about Native people today in the US as a whole, but in particular in the SCAG region. So next, I'd like to give you a bit of context about how this project came about. About 2 years ago, SCAG approached our team at Brookings and asked if we'd be interested in collaborating with them on a research project centered on data in Native communities. SCAG has a variety of reasons for being interested in improving the quality of data on tribes and Native people. SCAG is obviously the MPO for 6 Southern California counties. Those counties have 191 cities, area encompassing more than 38,000 square miles, serving 19 million people, about half the state's population. And that population includes 16 federally recognized tribes, nearly 40,000 people living on tribal land, and over 500,000 residents in the region that are classified as American Indian and Alaska Native. SCAG also has 7 voting policy committee seats in its governance structure representing tribal governments. So tribes matter and Native people matter to SCAG in that regard. SCAG also develops a variety of data-related products that affect tribes and Native people in the region. Things like long-range transportation plans, regional housing needs allocations, and a portion of the South Coast Air Quality Management Plan. So economic data and analysis are important to many of the planning and research efforts of SCAG. And then most importantly, maybe for our purposes, well, the relationship between the federal government and to a lesser degree states and tribes has been defined through laws and court rulings. Less attention has historically been directed to the relationships between regional government organizations, local government organizations, and Native communities. But because of their involvement, because of regional and local governments' involvement in matters such as transportation and land use planning that are really important to tribes, things like education and other factors of local governance, these organizations can really have an outsized impact on Native communities. So SCAG was interested in learning how they can get that relationship right. Our team at Brookings works extensively on place-based policy with an eye toward demographic inclusion. Really quickly, we were originally exploring how to build a product based on another Brookings Metro product called the Black Progress Index, which looks at the well-being of Black Americans across different geographies in the US. We were interested in seeing if we could do something similar for Native communities. And what we found is that across multiple data sets from sources such as the CDC, the Census Bureau, and others, there were data quality issues that were so significant that it prevented us from putting together any sorts of statistically significant findings. So we pivoted our work, and our project has had 3 goals. First, we look to identify the data needs in federal and state data for tribes and Native people in the SCAG region. Second, we combined interviews with tribes and other regional stakeholders with our own research to explore ideas for how states and regions can better engage with tribes to fill data gaps. And then third, we'll put together a series of ideas for action to advance new approaches for data collection and ownership. And I'll also say, I think, regional tribal partnerships that center tribes and tribal sovereignty. And then just a level set, this report focuses on a 6-county SCAG region. So much of our report material is centered on that region and the tribes situated there. But I think many of the challenges we identified in the ideas for action that we surface have both statewide and I would say, especially at this moment, national relevance. So just to take a step back, why does good data matter? We argue in the report that it matters for 2 fundamental reasons. First, data is an essential component for safeguarding tribal sovereignty. And second, it's necessary to ensure that the federal government, states, and other stakeholders meet their trust and treaty obligations to tribes. Without good data, it becomes more difficult to effectively manage many core aspects of tribal government and the trust relationship, including areas like economic development, health, education, access to funding, and many others. So this is really about ensuring tribes can function as effective sovereign entities. In the report, we identify 5 major challenges affecting data about tribes and Native Americans. First, sample sizes for data about Native Americans are often too small, which affects the quality of many data sets about tribes and Native American people. Second, the relative remoteness and non-contiguous geography of tribal reservations make data collection and aggregation more difficult. Third, many data sets treat Native Americans as just a race, a decision that reflects misunderstandings about Native identity and tribal governance. Fourth, data sets are often designed without tribal input, and data sets don't always reflect tribal needs or interests. And then fifth, some federal, state, and local data remains inaccessible to tribes. So I'll go through each of these in a bit more detail over the next couple of slides. The first challenge we identified is that sample size for Native Americans are often too small. The National Congress of American Indians has described this trend as creating an asterisk nation, because an asterisk is often used in data displays about Native Americans rather than a data point. These small sample sizes mean that numbers measuring the same indicator about Native Americans often vary significantly across data sets, and margins of error are significantly larger within data sets for Native people than they are for other groups. And then, of course, some data about Native people just doesn't get published at all due to the risk of exposing personally identifiable information. To illustrate this, in the report, we compare the variance across different census data sets for Native Americans and the US population as a whole. Across 3 of the most popular census data products, the decennial census, the 1-year American Community Survey, and the 5-year American Community Survey, there is a 1% variation in the US population as a whole. So these 3 data sets vary by 1% for the overall US. For Native Americans, there's a 24% variance across those 3 data sets. And for Native Americans in the state of California, there's a 20% variance. So again, the order of magnitude here is about 20 to 25 times larger for Native people than the US population as a whole. And then looking at data quality and availability. For the 16 federally recognized tribes that we work with in the SCAG region, none have ACS one-year data estimates available for their populations or lands. 3 have margins of error that exceed their population count entirely, and 2 have no population data at all. This level of variance would be considered unacceptable, I think, for any other level of government in the US. So the second challenge is that the relative remoteness and non-contiguous geography of tribal reservations makes data collection and aggregation more difficult. This problem manifests in 2 ways. Statistical surveys tend to undercount Native American populations, particularly those on tribal land. And because reservations have unique geographic patterns, it makes it more difficult to align many data sets with tribal land. So here in this picture, we show the path of the Southern Pacific Railroad, which led to the breakup of multiple reservations in the SCAG region, and today influences the quality of data for reservations in the region. The third challenge we identify is that many data sets treat Native Americans as just a race, reflecting misunderstanding of tribal governance and Native identity. So, some on the call know this, but unique among demographic groups in the US, Native American identity is considered both a racial identity and a political classification. But many data sets collect and classify data on Native Americans as just one of multiple racial groups, rather than a separate designation reflecting this unique political nature of Native identity. As we write in the report, this creates 3 major problems for data about Native Americans. First, many data sets don't report data by tribe, making it significantly less helpful for Native nations. Second, the federal government defines American Indians and Alaska Natives as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North, Central, and South America, which means that a large portion of US government-defined Native Americans in many data sets actually have their ancestry in countries outside of the US. And then third, as the graphic on the left of this slide shows, nearly 9 in 10 US government-defined Native American people are classified as either multiracial or Hispanic in California. And so are not counted as American Indian or Alaska Native in many data sets, but instead as part of either the 2 or more races or the Hispanic categories. This makes demographic data on Native Americans less representative. In addition, as you can see on the right, tribal communities indigenous to certain places, such as Southern California, where we've been working, often make up just a small portion of the region's total Native American population. This impacts tribal governance by making it more difficult to disaggregate data for local tribes in federal and state data sources, particularly if tribal affiliation isn't collected. And then just to emphasize this point, again, here's the federal government's definition of American Indian and Alaska Native. So you can see here, not only does it explicitly state that's inclusive of people from North, Central, and South America, but it also lists several non-US indigenous affiliations, specifically Aztec and Maya. This definition makes data work on Native Americans and tribes more difficult, and I would say, inhibits the relationship between the federal, state, and local and regional governments and tribes. I say that because it means that data collected by the statistical arms of federal and state governments don't always align with the definitions of tribes or Native communities used by the arms of government that provide services to tribes and Native people. Many of these service-providing agencies typically work with enrolled citizens and descendants of federally and sometimes state-recognized tribes. But despite that, many funding allocations, including on the federal level, are nonetheless based on this much broader definition of American Indian and Alaska Native. So there's a mismatch, and it makes it difficult to line up data with services. The fourth challenge we identify is that data sets are often designed without tribal input. Oh, sorry, there we go. Data sets are often designed without tribal input, and data sets don't always reflect tribal needs or interests. Because many federal and state surveys are based on the requirements of law and agency regulation at those levels of government, the needs of tribal governments haven't been historically prioritized in developing statistical surveys. For example, while other levels of government can rely on tax revenue to fund government operations, taxes are frequently not an option for tribes, many of which have small populations, a significant number of low-income citizens, and are trying to maintain competitiveness with off-reservation communities. Instead, many tribes operate tribally owned enterprises that bring in both economic growth and revenue to the tribe, as well as the regions they're in, but they don't fit neatly into existing data sets. In other cases, tribes may want to measure indicators that other levels of government just really aren't interested in, things like indigenous language proficiency. This means that the data that federal and state statistical agencies collect often doesn't reflect some of the highest priority needs of tribal governance. Some tribes are taking the initiative to improve their own data. So on the left here is the non-federally recognized Fernandeño-Tataviam Band's Tribal Climate Resilience Plan, which the tribe informed in part through its own data collection. And the tribe also runs a periodic tribal census. Some efforts are also underway at the federal and state levels to identify how existing data can be made more relevant for tribes, or how tribal data can be utilized in federal and state data sets. For example, the Census Bureau has an ongoing initiative aimed at improving access to tribal data by repackaging existing statistics and data sets across a variety of tribal and native boundaries. They also recently entered into an MOU with the Osage Nation to leverage Osage Nation's census data to validate US Census data about tribes. So on the right here is a signing ceremony for that agreement. However, these types of efforts are really nascent and need more resources to scale up. And then the fifth challenge we identified is that some federal, state, and local data remains inaccessible to tribes. Federal, state, and local government agencies, as well as nonprofit organizations, and even for-profit companies, collect data through surveys or other processes and store and control that data for their own uses. However, because tribes disproportionately rely on outside data, data about their lands and citizens is often controlled by these non-tribal entities. And currently, much of that data isn't public. While the federal government and states have some processes in place for tribes to access that data in limited settings, as we write in the report, these efforts don't necessarily go far enough. On the federal level, the US government has taken steps to make some personally identifiable federal data more accessible to certain groups, including tribes, through the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. This law calls on federal agencies to create standard application processes for entities, including tribal governments, to apply for access to confidential federal microdata, which consists of personally identifiable survey responses. Individuals or entities approved through this process receive a special designation known as special sworn status. However, while this law provides a legal pathway for tribes to access some data, it nonetheless leaves several significant barriers. Most recently, that's included the removal or inability to access certain federal data sets that have been shut down due to ongoing funding cuts or changes in federal policy priorities. So on the slide right now is a screenshot of ResearchData.gov, which is the web portal for accessing data for entities with special sworn status. So as you can see at the top, there's a growing number of data sets that are no longer accessible through the system. To add further context to these challenges, our team hosted a series of roundtables and qualitative discussions with tribal leaders, state and local officials, experts on Native American data, and other stakeholders in the SCAG region. We spoke with over 60 individuals across 30 interviews and listening sessions, and summarized what we heard into 6 insights about the state of Native American data in the SCAG region. So in effect, this is what we heard regional stakeholders saying about the state of Native data in Southern California. The first insight that we heard is that tribes engage with data in a variety of different ways and have a strong interest in data that more accurately measures their populations and lands. During our conversations, nearly all tribal stakeholders could name multiple use cases for data that they leveraged across different government functions, and tribal leaders were nearly unanimous that they'd like to see more done by federal and state partners to ensure government data sources more accurately represent them. Second, while tribes have a wide array of different economic conditions, tribal leaders really saw data as a key enabler for accessing federal, state, and regional funding to meet critical economic development needs. Again, because tribes often don't have a tax base, grant-based funding is a significant portion of their government budgets. A core emphasis of tribal stakeholders in our conversations was that data sets that don't allow them to break out population subgroups, that used out-of-date or lagging data, or that didn't have relevant geographies harm their ability to successfully compete for federal, state, and other grants. Third, tribes told us that a lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty by non-native entities contributes to misunderstanding about them as government entities. Multiple tribal leaders said that they felt that they were sometimes not treated as government partners, but rather as nonprofit organizations or even private sector developers. As to how this relates to data, we heard this lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty leads to less data transparency and less collaboration between tribal governments and other government agencies. Tribal leaders said they at times felt like an afterthought when non-native government entities created new data products, and that the lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty made it harder for them to access non-public data in particular. The fourth insight that we heard is that sample sizes, tribal boundaries, and the other challenges that we outlined earlier inhibit the development of new data products by and for Native communities. We asked tribal leaders if they could provide us with examples of data tools they had built using publicly available data, and none of the tribal leaders we spoke with could give an example. However, they did say that there were several non-public data sets that they felt could provide more accurate estimates of tribal demographics and other important tribal governance needs. Fifth, tribes vary significantly in their data capacity, priorities, and desire for autonomy versus regional or state involvement in data creation. So what I mean by that is different tribes have different interests and needs when it comes to data. Some tribes have robust in-house analytics departments, while others have relatively little capacity to engage in data work given more pressing needs. Tribes also vary in their opinion of how involved state and regional agencies should be in data development. Some tribal leaders wanted to see more proactive state and regional government agency in improving tribal data. Others wanted more autonomy and recognition to do their own data collection with little external support or oversight. And then finally, many current government processes and structures struggle to support tribal data capacity. Because tribal data needs and data capacity vary significantly, non-native governmental organizations need both a dedicated plan and robust and sustained outreach to ensure tribal data needs are truly understood and can be met by state and regional actors. But we found through conversation that there's wide variation in how non-native government agencies engage with tribes, and that can inhibit the ability of well-intentioned state, regional, and local government officials to adequately support tribal needs. So in response to the challenges we identified, we developed a four-part agenda of ideas for action to help support Native data needs in Southern California and beyond. Within each of these topic areas, we have two sets of recommendations. First, we have regional ideas for action, which are actions that regional government organizations like SCAG or others could implement. We couple those with a set of state and federal ideas for action, which are actions to smooth the pathway for and amplify the impact of regional efforts. And again, the idea here is that while these are, Southern California centered, we think they have broad applicability across many regions and states. So the four topic areas we recommend action across are: first, implementing data strategies for interacting with tribes and tribal data. Second, investing in tribal data capacity. Third, supporting tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And fourth, making government data more accurate and relevant to Indigenous peoples. So now I'll just quickly highlight one or two actions from each topic, and then pivot a little bit more into some of my best practice recommendations. So the first idea for action really centers on implementing data strategies to set a foundation for ethical, meaningful, and mutually beneficial engagement with tribes and native communities around data. These types of strategies could also encompass other relevant areas of formal and informal relationship building between tribes and regional entities to strengthen mutual trust. In particular, we think both regional and state level Indigenous data strategies could provide momentum for other action. There are a variety of international best practices from Canada, New Zealand, and Australia that the Southern California region, California as a state, and the US as a whole could draw from. There are also an array of national native organizations in the US, such as the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, that work in this space. We also note that regional entities could partner with regional native organizations to ensure that any strategy is guided by the priorities and expectations of local tribes. So in Southern California, this could include, for example, the Tribal Alliance of Sovereign Indian Nations or the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association. As our next set of ideas, we explore how regional, state, and federal agencies could look to deploy resources to develop tribes' internal data capacity. On the regional level, organizations can develop new data programs and tools in partnership with tribes. This would look different across different tribes and across different regions. In some cases, it may be helping tribes get subscriptions to private data sets that they couldn't otherwise access. In other cases, it can be more hands-on technical assistance, such as supporting tribes as they develop culturally relevant data best practices. For tribes interested in more robust support, one idea we heard was for regional organizations to work with tribes on a voluntary basis to transform census data and other public microdata into tribally relevant indicators to support tribal decision making. One example we heard was of this work was the partnership between the Quetzal tribe in Northern Arizona University to do some of this type of data transformation. On the state level, there's an obvious need, I think, for the state legislature to provide funding for tribal data needs. In addition, we think that more state agencies could provide technical backbones and expertise to support the development of new data tools. Some agencies and offices are already working with tribes on data-related topics. One example we cite in the report is the California State Water Resources Control Board's Tribal Water Data Initiative, which has worked with tribes to develop an online mapping platform with information on water resources on tribal lands informed by the express needs of local tribal leaders. So I think that there's a variety of different opportunities for state and local and regional action there. Next, we put forward a set of ideas to support tribal sovereignty and self-determination through data. Here, because most public data is collected and controlled by the federal government and state governments, most of the latitude for action is at those levels. There's only so much regional organizations can do on this topic, but one step regions could take would be to allow tribes to provide their own data for accessing regional grants and funding. In the report, we note that some grant programs have requirements that any application materials be made available to the public through federal or state Freedom of Information Acts. In instances where policies like that are in effect, regional organizations could explore ways that they can protect tribal data when it is in the interest of tribes, such as by allowing tribes to self-certify that they meet grant requirements, or automatically designating tribes and tribal land as eligible entities for certain types of grants. On the state level, California could look at developing a statewide equivalent to something like the federal government's special sworn status designation to allow access to state microdata and other data resources. Some protected data from, for example, the California Department of Healthcare Services is currently available for research and public health purposes. So that could be, one foothold to explore expanding, for example. And then we write about the opportunity to develop things like secure online portals for tribal governments to more easily access data about tribal lands and tribal citizens currently held by state and federal agencies. One example of this being done is a recent initiative in New Zealand called Te Wata, where Stats New Zealand, which is the federal census and statistical bureau in that country, worked with Maori tribes, the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, to create protected online portals accessible to Maori tribal leaders of key data needed for internal governance. So we write a bit more about that in the report. And then finally, we explore ideas to make government data more representative of and relevant to indigenous peoples. So on the regional level, one fairly straightforward idea would be for regions and local agencies to implement new federal guidance issued last year on improving the practices around aggregating race and ethnicity data. That federal guidance was called Statistical Policy Directive 15 or SBD 15. I'll talk a bit more about it in a little bit. As we mentioned, nearly 9 out of every 10 census-defined Native American people in California is classified as either multiracial or Hispanic in government data. So that means many data sets reporting data on Native Americans include just 10% potentially of the total Native population of the state. So these new standards that the federal government put out last year have guidance for how agencies can report more robust data about not only Native American people, but other small populations. This guidance and these recommendations really haven't been rolled out in many federal, state, or local settings yet. So regional agencies, that we think there's opportunity for them to help local governments understand how to implement these new standards to best improve data about Native people. And then on the state level, we think that policymakers could explore how to provide tribes themselves with a bigger role in surveying their own residents for relevant data sets. These types of partnerships already exist on the federal level, with tribes playing an important role in supporting enumeration for the decennial census. I mentioned the Fernandinho Tataviam's tribal census and the MOU between the Census Bureau and the Osage Nation. So this type of work is already underway in many places, and I think there's opportunity for that to be scaled up in more communities. State policymakers, we think, also could explore more formally supporting this type of work, such as by providing funding to tribes that conduct tribal surveys designed by the tribe to meet tribal needs. But that could include information to inform relevant state and federal data sets. Any data that tribes provide to their state or federal partners could be done purely on a voluntary basis, and there could be strict MOUs that govern the protection of data and tribal sovereignty. So I know this has been a lot of discussion around ideas for policy and administrative actions that could be taken to strengthen relationships for regions and tribes. I know there are also folks on the call today who are interested in learning about how to collect, aggregate, or publish Native-related data. So to close the discussion, I'd like to take you through some of my personal recommendations for best practices around Native data. I'm going to be covering 4 topics here. First, data collection, or the actual surveying and questioning to generate data. Second, data aggregation, or how that collected data is then categorized into groups and published. Third, data access, which is who's able to utilize data without prohibitive barriers to entry. And then finally, data publication, which involves deciding what data to make public and how. So first, I have 4 recommendations for those who work in data collection. So whether that's collecting government-led surveys for public data, or doing private research, or even for-profit surveying. My first recommendation is I strongly recommend oversampling tribal lands and Native populations to ensure you have statistically significant sample sizes for Native people and geographies. One example of this being done in California is in the California Health Interview Survey, or CHIS. CHIS has run an oversample of Native Americans every 10 years. So in the report, we highlight this and actually recommend that this oversample should be done more often, ideally every year. And I'll just note that while my focus is on Native American populations, I think this recommendation is really applicable to any small population group, including Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islander communities, which have a relatively small but significant population in Southern California, as well as other racial, ethnic, and other groups. Next, I strongly recommend that all surveys collect data on tribal identity, consistent with best practices. When you collect data on Native people, but don't ask for tribal identity, it makes the data significantly less useful for tribal communities themselves. So again, thinking about who core audiences are for the use of data. To the extent that you want any data collected about Native people to help tribes and Native-led organizations themselves, collecting tribal affiliation data is really crucial. So on the right of the slide, I've highlighted 2 reports by Tracy Madej Karageorge and Nara Nayar at the American Institutes for Research. These reports are titled 1, State Approaches to Tribal Affiliation for Data Collection, and 2, Tribal Affiliation Data Collection and Public Education, a primer. These are 2 of the best papers for government agencies, and I think other surveying organizations to review to ensure that they're meeting best practices around collecting data on tribal affiliation. Third, for non-government surveys, and also for some government surveys as well, it's really important to determine whether and how tribes can access or even own data collected on tribal land or about tribal citizens. This is particularly important if your data isn't going to be publicly accessible. Individuals collecting surveys should develop relationships with tribes and other Native-led organizations and work to find ways to share relevant data from their surveying efforts to support tribal governance. And then finally, a small but growing number of tribes now run tribal institutional review boards, or IRBs, to oversee research on human subjects involving their lands and citizens, and to ensure their rights and welfare are protected. If a tribe you're trying to work with has an IRB, you should respect that process for any research or data collection you're doing on tribal subjects or on human subjects. Next, I'll touch on a set of recommendations and best practices for aggregating data about tribes and Native people. So my first recommendation, and this is one of the most common approaches I see, is to, where possible, avoid lumping Native American people into a catch-all other category. So this might not always be possible. Sometimes sample sizes prevent that from happening. When that's the case, I recommend including a note on any charts or graphics explaining that inadequate sample sizes prevent the creation of a separate data category for Native Americans or any smaller groups. And then a corollary to this is that, really the only thing worse than lumping Native people into a catch-all other group is just not acknowledging them at all in the data. So for example, there are data sets that sometimes just have 4 groups: white, black, Hispanic, and Asian, and nothing else. So if you really can't break out data about Native people, my recommended approach is to include some sort of category, even if you need to combine multiple groups or use asterisks, and then include a detailed note about why it's not possible to show Native Americans and other smaller groups. Next, where possible, try to use the most inclusive definitions of American Indian, Alaska Native in your data. My recommendation is that if you're able to include data on both single race and multiracial and multi-ethnic Native Americans as separate data lines. So as we've discussed today, the single race Native American population is a relatively small subset of the total Native population, especially in California. And so it doesn't tell the full story about how all Native people are faring. At the same time, the multiracial and Hispanic inclusive definitions of American Indian, Alaska Native include a lot of indigenous people whose ancestry is from other countries, particularly Latin America. And so in some cases, that may be too broad of a definition for certain usage. So that's why, if possible, I think it's helpful to include data on both the AIAN alone, the American Indian Alaska Native alone population, and the American Indian Alaska Native in combination with another group population. And just to take this one step further, if you can, it's actually a best practice to break out multi-race identities as individual categories. So for example, you might include an American Indian Alaska Native alone category, a category of American Indian Alaska Native and white in combination, AIAN and black, AIN and white and black, and so on. These smaller categories can help show nuance across different groups and allow data users to aggregate the data to a level that they feel is most appropriate. I think generally speaking, if you take that approach, you should also consider a minimum population threshold for each category and only break out categories that are larger than that threshold. So just to show an example of how organizations can go about it, on the right on this slide are 2 examples of how race and ethnicity data has been treated in recent versions of SCAG's demographic and growth forecast technical report. So as you can see on the top, in the 2020 report, SCAG included Native people under a catch-all Asian and others category. And then in the 2024 iteration of the report, they improved it by creating new categories for non-Hispanic American Indians and non-Hispanic Pacific Islanders. So those are obviously both small groups, less than half a percentage point of the population, but I think it's important to acknowledge still that they exist. So taking this example, there's still more that SCAG can do on this front. They still take, for example, in the 2024 data, the approach of top coding Hispanic identity, which means they included all Hispanic people, regardless of race, in the Hispanic category, while keeping out every other group as non-Hispanic. They also use, again, a blanket kind of 2 or more races category without breaking out any detail. So how could this be improved? I think, for example, this data could benefit from an appendix showing the total population of Native people, inclusive of mixed race and Hispanic Native Americans. Given what we know about demographics in California, the full population of Native people in the SCAG region is likely actually more than 2.5% of the region's total population, rather than just 0.3%. So having some additional data breakdowns by racial and ethnic combinations can be really helpful. And like I mentioned earlier, if you want additional guidance for implementing best practices around data aggregation, particularly for small groups, I really emphasize the suggestion to look at the Office of Management and Budget's Statistical Policy Directive 15, or SPD 15. The SPD 15 guidance really provides the detailed best practices for how government agencies and other statistical organizations can better collect and aggregate race and ethnicity data to show a more comprehensive demographic picture. I think it's really a solid resource. And then I'll note 2 other practices here for aggregating Native data. So first is you can consider categorizing individuals across other subgroups beyond just race and ethnicity. Particularly if you're collecting tribal affiliation, it could be helpful to explore other subgroups of different Native populations, groups like local tribes, California tribes, or US versus Canadian and Latin American Native people. And then finally, if you're looking for ways to make Native people more visible, but you're concerned about sample sizes, you can explore aggregating time series data to increase sample sizes. So this approach works much better for data that is collected at more frequent intervals. For example, the Minneapolis Fed Center for Indian Country Development uses a rolling 3-month average to form the basis of its Native American labor market dashboard. Obviously, 3 months is less frequent than monthly data, which is the standard for any other labor market data in the US. But that's still frequent enough, this rolling 3-month average is still frequent enough that you can discern emerging patterns for Native people in the labor market. So contrast that with the Census Bureau, which uses 5-year averages for its American Community Survey data for most Native American reservations. When we're thinking about what data is included in the most recent 5-year data averages, which cover the years 2019 to 2023, you have in that the tail end of the 2010s recovery, the outbreak of COVID and the recession it caused, the beginning of the COVID recovery, and then the period of high inflation during the early 2020s. So much of the data included in these 5-year samples probably isn't representative of real-time economic conditions for Native American reservations and Native people today. So again, if you're choosing to aggregate data over time, the length of time that you're including matters, and the more frequent, the better. Now I want to just go through a few recommendations for expanding access to tribal data and data about Native people. So first, for place-based data, it's always helpful to have tribal geographies available if possible. To the extent that sample sizes are large enough to publish reservation-based data, that can be a huge step for supporting tribal governing partners and increasing representation of Native people. However, it's not always possible to publish tribal geography data due to small sample sizes. When that's the case, it can be a good test case for sharing data with Native partners, even if that data can't be made public. For example, is it possible to share anonymized microdata for individuals identifying as a tribe with that tribe? Is there a way you can structure the survey where you explain that data about individuals identifying as American Indian Alaska Native will be shared with relevant tribal partners? These are the types of new data relationships that governments, nonprofits, and companies can explore. And I think it can be worth talking about those same steps for existing data sets as well. Can government agencies create public cuts of data about tribal land from existing publicly available data? Do nonprofits have data where they've collected tribal affiliations that they can share with local tribes? It's always worth exploring these different collaboration opportunities. And then finally, for government agencies, I think it's worth looking at how to facilitate more data ownership by tribes. For example, rather than surveying Native people on tribal land, you can fund tribes to run their own surveys, where the tribe then owns the data and shares back with you relevant data that you can use for your purposes. One model that entities could look at, for this type of collaboration in tribally led surveying is existing decennial census enumeration practices, where tribes and tribal volunteers often lead on data collection on tribal land. And then just for context, on the right here is a graphic overviewing the geographic availability of Census American Community Survey data for Native Americans in the SCAG region. So this is just to give you a sense of how limited data is currently for Native people in many places. ACS data typically offers 4 data profiles: social, economic, housing, and demographic characteristics, with estimates either on the 1-year level or the 5-year level. So the orange block in this graphic indicates years and counties where partial data profiles are available, so some subset of the 4 major profiles. And the few blue boxes indicate instances where all 4 full data profiles are available. So what our team found is that the last time that every county and MSA in the SCAG region had a full set of data profiles available for Native people was the 2021 5-year estimates. And then prior to that, you have to go back to 2010 to find full data profiles for every county in the SCAG region, again on the 5-year level. So again, we're making decisions in 2025, and the only full data available is from 2021 and 2010, and even that is just 5 years aggregated together. This is just to show that there's really limited data and really limited data access across many geographies. So this isn't just about tribal land. This is a challenge affecting Native people on many different geographies. And then finally, I want to share some thoughts for researchers and non-government organizations publishing data about tribes and Native Americans. So my first recommendation is to seek consent and tribal buy-in before publishing data affecting tribes or Native populations. This will look different depending on what the data set is that you're working with and what the population level is that it covers. So for example, for an article that uses public data and covers large geographies like states, this might look like sharing the article for review with an outside Native researcher before publishing. However, if you're publishing using any data products based on tribally created data or data about an individual tribe, then the best practice is to get explicit tribal consent before publishing that. And I'd say this rule can even be applied to certain instances of public data. In particular, if you're transforming public data into tribe-level insights that couldn't be created by a person without specialized data skills, I recommend getting tribal consent before publishing any individual tribal-level data. So what does this look like in practice? Let me share a recent example from our team's work. In July, our team published an article measuring the impact of the Office of Management and Budget's proposed federal funding freeze on tribal communities. That piece used public data sourced from usaspending.gov. So technically, nothing in it was proprietary. There was also a potentially compelling argument to publish individual tribal level data to make the case for how much funding different tribes stood to lose from this policy if it were to go into effect. However, given the nature of the piece, which was measuring grant programs at risk of cancellation, We thought that the downside risk of publishing data on individual tribes' grants was greater than the public benefit that would come from publishing them. As a result, we chose to publish the piece using aggregated agency-level data, federal agency-level data, as well as aggregated state-level data. This allowed us to tell the story we want to tell, but still have subject area and geographic components without putting individual tribes' data out there in the open. So when thinking about what level to aggregate place-based data in public settings, generally I'd say that state data can be fine, and county-level data can be fine in counties with multiple tribes. So San Diego County has 17 tribes, for example. That's more than many states. It would probably be tough to reverse engineer individual tribal data from that if you're using public data. However, even in these instances, I recommend trying to get tribal buy-in and support for any research or publication you're doing. So in Southern California, maybe that looks like briefing tribal associations, like the Tribal Alliance of Sovereign Indian Nations, or the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association on your work and your plans for publication. And then I think a corollary to all of this is to not publish data in geographies where it's possible to reverse engineer tribe-level data. So my tribe's home county is Barnstable County, Massachusetts. We are the only tribe in that county. So I wouldn't recommend publishing tribal grant data for Barnstable County, Massachusetts, for example. It would very obviously be grants to my tribe and only my tribe. And then finally, I just want to reconcile this slide with the previous one. So how could I on the previous slide say, make sure to publish tribal geographies, when you're doing data work? And then on this one say, make sure not to have any individual tribes' data made public. It really comes back to who's doing the data publication and the relationship that they have with tribes. If you're a federal, state, or local government agency, and you're already publishing public data for counties, municipalities, zip codes, census tracts, or census blocks, I think there can be net benefits that come from publishing tribal geographies as well. It signals that tribal geographies are legitimate governing entities and can support tribal governance. But again, it all comes back to consent in the government-to-government relationship. Ideally, these government agencies will be communicating with tribes throughout the government data collection process. And so tribes are both expecting the data to be published and know it's being done in a way where tribes can make use of it. For individual researchers, nonprofit organizations, or other non-government entities, I think the calculation can be a little different. Unless you've been working with tribes, tribal associations, or other partners in Indian country throughout your work, you're typically safer avoiding publishing individual tribe-level data unless you've gotten permission. And again, the alternative here is even if you don't make tribe-level data public, you can still offer it privately to tribal leaders. When we published our OMB funding freeze piece in July, we didn't publish individual tribal data. However, as a result of us creating the piece, we did end up possessing a database of individual tribal data. So what we did is we offered to tribal leaders that we could pull their tribe's individual data and share it with them privately. So that way tribes would still be able to access relevant data for their governance purposes without it being made public. All right, I know that was a lot of content. That's the end of my presentation. I'd like to say Katapatanamu, thank you to SCAG for inviting me to speak and for their partnership throughout this work. And thank you all for joining the discussion today. So this is my contact information for those who are interested in reaching out. And now I'm really looking forward to opening up the discussion to wherever folks want to take it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Robert. Let's now turn it over to questions. As we go into these questions, I saw one question come in. If you have questions, feel free to add them into the chat. You can also use the raise hand function if you'd like to, speak your question out loud. I saw our first question that came in was from Jill, and she asked, can you give any resources for setting up data governance agreements with tribes as a part of the data collection process?
Yeah, there's been work in Canada. Actually, our report goes through some of this. There has been a lot of work done in Canada on the federal level about setting up data governance relationships between the federal government of Canada and their statistical agency, and then tribal government leads. And so they've had a series of working groups there that I think can serve really as like a best practice for the type of collaboration and underlying kind of like agreement and governance that should go on there. The other one that I really recommend looking at is the MOU between the what's called the iwi Tribal Leaders Working Group in New Zealand and the Stats New Zealand federal agency. So that's the agreement that governs the work being done between the federal government of New Zealand and their statistical agencies with tribal leaders there. And again, I think that can serve as a really good template. Closer to home, I know SCAG has an MOU with the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association. It's not specifically data focused, but it does talk about some governance issues. And I think that there are a couple data related provisions involved in that. So that might be another more local MOU to look at that could serve as kind of like a baseline for the US context.
Great, thank you, Robert. And that was a great question. If other folks have other questions, feel free to add them into the chat. I have a question.
Yeah, definitely. And I
go
would
ahead.
just say to Anika that there's like no
Yeah.
question that is like too basic, or people should not be afraid of sounding like, you know, they're asking the wrong thing or something. I know for folks, especially that haven't been in the space before, it can feel kind of new and overwhelming. And so like, don't be embarrassed, just ask whatever you're thinking if you've got anything, you know, in mind. But yeah, sorry, go ahead, Anika.
I definitely appreciate that qualifier. I think folks, you know, sometimes folks are scared to ask a question, but we welcome all questions. So thanks for giving that. I know that I have a question that came up during the presentation. I was curious if you could just elaborate on some of the best practices that you've seen elsewhere around the country or internationally. To share those.
Yeah, I want to go back to the New Zealand example that I mentioned a couple times and just really talk about what's powerful with that. So this is it's called Te Wata. It's this platform that was built, you know, in combination between a group of tribal leaders there, Maori tribal leaders, and the federal government of New Zealand. And there's really three things that I think are quite powerful about it. And I think it's, you know, potentially applicable not only to the US, but maybe to the California context. You know, the first is, you know, the relationship between Stats New Zealand and the iwi working group, the way they designed their, you know, relationship, giving them both co-equal power, really shows, I think, an excellent way for government tribal collaboration where one party isn't dominating the other. So just the governance structure of that was, I thought, really impressive. The second was that tribes appoint what's called an iwi or tribal data manager, and that person is a point person between the government and the tribe, and they serve as basically a liaison to help the tribe and help the federal government determine what data should be posted publicly and what shouldn't. And so nothing is posted publicly without the tribe explicitly saying, we want this public. And so different tribes have different public data. They all have the same amount of private data available, but depending on what the tribe is comfortable with, they have a lot of leeway around what gets made public. And then the third is, because of this partnership, the government of New Zealand has really begun surveying new areas that are of key interest to tribal leaders and tribal stakeholders that they hadn't previously. So I mentioned Indigenous language proficiency as an example of that. That's one of the indicators that many tribes are tracking now, the share of their population that can speak their tribe's language fluently, or at different levels of proficiency. And so I thought, again, this idea of the partnership not only giving rise to access and data, but also new data indicators that are really relevant for tribal governance was really important. It's really got those two benefits. So I think that kind of New Zealand example is best practice. We've seen other work being done in Australia where they consulted with tribes on kind of a non-binding report to inform a future Indigenous data strategy. I don't think that strategy was ever ultimately implemented, but they kind of did some framing report work. And then again, the work in Canada by the relationship between the federal Indigenous data centers and the federal government there has been really powerful. But I still think that New Zealand example, for a bunch of reasons, is a gold standard. The last thing I'll say is, there may be opportunities for that to be done on the state level in California in some capacity. California, depending on how you measure it, 8th or 9th largest economy in the world, right? Probably roughly, I think there are more people in Southern California alone than in the entire country of New Zealand, right? So the population is here. The power, the governance is economic power, the governance capability is here. And so if there were opportunities to explore it, are there ways that state or regional data can be shared in this collaborative way, in this private way, in this really, native data ownership way, with tribal governing partners? That could be really powerful. And the reason we were so interested in this region at Brookings is because of your capacity to really serve as a potential first mover for the rest of the country.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing some of the best practices that you've seen. I see Alex has their hand raised. Alex, would you like to go ahead?
Hi. Hi, Robert. Nice to see you again. SCAG up here, Sacramento area. And I had a quick question. If you had any insight to share on kind of balancing things you can start to do at an agency level to take a look at the data that you have and kind of ask some questions that have disaggregation or tribal populations and tribal governments in mind versus like starting, or with an intent to explore a conversation with tribal governments and say, like, how could we find that mutual benefit? Like, how could we be useful? What could we provide? We provide public data versus not looking at anything and talking to tribes and saying, hey, what would you like to see? Because I feel like sometimes like we don't know what we don't know, and we want to find a way to communicate the relevance and the potential value without scaring folks into being like, oh my gosh, you have all this information about us, or you're looking at things that we don't want you to look at, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful and really powerful observation. And I think it cuts two ways too, right? The other thing you don't want to do, and this is something that I've experienced throughout my career, is you don't want to necessarily go to tribal leaders with no plan whatsoever and say, okay, what do you want to see with data? And it's like, well, I don't know, what data are we talking about, right? Like everyone has a different definition of data. We all have different jobs. Like, I don't even have time to think about this, right? I think, going into these conversations with really two things. I think like a sense of like, your role and like kind of the statutory and other authority that you have around data collection can be really important, in explaining like, here are the data sets we collect or aggregate, and here's why we do that. And really, I think one of the powerful things that NPOs and other regional councils of government can do is show, here is how other member governments have utilized this data, and really make it clear that like, this is like the potential of this data for your own governing priorities. So here's what we collect, and here's how that's been used by other levels of government in the past. And then I think like identifying with each of those some of the shortcomings that you see with those data sets for Native people, right? Like, oh yeah, we collect data, but we've never done it in a way like we do it on the census tract level. So like we have a map that, yeah, it has Native geographies on it, but it doesn't actually break out Native geographies. Are you interested in seeing Native geographies being broken out? Would that be helpful? Oh yeah, we have this public health data. We always ask people their race, but it's just been like one box, and we've never asked tribal affiliation. If we started collecting this, would you be interested in using this for your tribal health priorities, right? And I think like coming to these conversations with a sense of what you do and why you do it, how that has been leveraged by other government agencies, and then a few proactive ideas about ways that you think you could be useful can be really helpful for setting the tone of that conversation.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
I just want to say
see-
thank you. Yeah, I saw I was muted. That was
Great.
really, really helpful. Appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you. And I see we have another question also in the chat here from Jillian. Can you share in what ways published data around individual tribes without consent could negatively harm them?
Yeah. I mean, I can just go back to the piece that we wrote back in July, right? Where there was a moment where the federal government was exploring what different grants to cut because they may be specifically violating executive orders issued by the new presidential administration, things around race, climate, DEI, and spending. And so if we had gone in and said, you know, the Navajo Nation has X dollars of funding across these different areas, you know, education, transportation, clean energy, etc. If we said the Cherokee Nation has Y amount of clean energy funding, Z amount of, you know, education funding, that could potentially act as a roadmap for where to cut funding, for example. Like, oh, all of these clean energy grants don't align with the president's EO. Like, actually, that's a pretty good roadmap for what we want to go in and not spend money on, right? So you can have all these downstream unintended consequences to publishing tribal data without, you know, tribal consent, and it may not achieve, you know, the goals of what tribal leaders have. And so if your goal is to be, you know, publishing in a way that informs tribal leaders, informs policymakers, informs decision makers about the needs of tribes and tribal goals and tribal governance outcomes, you know, publishing this tribe level data without consent can actually have unintended consequences that undermine that. The other thing is it's almost like a signaling mechanism that they are not necessarily a level of government that is on par with other levels in the US, right? So to the extent that, you know, you are writing on tribes as a level of government in the US that express sovereignty, that have citizens and lands that they govern, you know, if you care about kind of those aspects of tribal governance, then allowing tribes the sovereignty and consent to weigh in about when data about them is published or not can be really important. And so, you know, this all I think comes back to some of the history in the way that the US has historically gone about collecting data about tribes and tribal land, in particular early on in US history with things like the census. The federal government would come in and be, you know, as enumerators, they would make decisions about who was native and who was not, who qualified and who didn't. And so there's still, I think, a lot of, you know, lingering wariness in Indian country about that historic approach that today even has effects on things like tribal enrollment, land policy, allotment, citizenship. And so because of that experience, there is a real premium put on tribal sovereignty, you know, not only to avoid unintended consequences, but to ensure that tribes get a say in what data looks like about them and what data is published about them.
Great, thank you so much. And I think we're all out of time for questions today, but thank you so much for such a terrific presentation today, Robert. I feel like I learned so much and I hope the audience did as well. I am so excited to continue this conversation. If other folks have any questions, feel free to follow up and we'll make sure to get those questions answered there from Robert.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nika, and thank you again to all of our SCAG partners. This really wouldn't have been able to happen without you, and we're just really appreciative for all the work that you've put into this.
Thank you. And Edward, thank you for pulling back up the slides. We just have a quick announcement before we wrap up today. So SCAG is rolling out a new program called the Future Leaders Initiative. This program is for youth ages 18 to 26, where they have the opportunity to engage in a 6-month civic leadership program that aims to deepen their knowledge of Connect SoCal planning principles, frameworks, and practices, and also provide opportunities for direct engagement with practitioners and local leaders. The applications are about to open here on Tuesday, October 14th. So if you're interested, please check out the link in the chat. And then finally, just want to say, if you're interested in learning more about the reports that we mentioned today, the Good Data, Stronger Tribes report and other SCAG IERS work, please check out the IERS page in the chat. And then thank you all to the participants. I hope you found this session useful today. We'd like to invite you to take a quick 2-minute survey to help us support future Toolbox Tuesdays. A link will pop up when the meeting ends, so if you don't have your phone handy, it'll still be available for you. And these sessions are also available for AICP CM credits through the American Planning Association. We'll post a link to that in the chat as well. And then finally, a special thanks to our AV technician, Edward, and all the SCAG staff that helped put this together today. Thank you again, and we hope you stay safe and healthy. Have a great day. Thank you.